My name is James Ford. I'm an assistant professor in geography here at McGill, and I specialise in looking at the human dimensions of climate change. I work mostly with communities in the Arctic, and also indigenous communities in the Amazon and Uganda, looking at the various pathways to which climate change affects people and how people adapt.
We've worked in communities across the Arctic, but since 2007, we've really focused on Iqaluit, which is the largest community in Nunavut. About 7,000 people live there, and it's really the hub of transport and services and also government for the entire Eastern Arctic. And our work there has really tried to understand how climate change has the potential to affect, and actually in some cases it's already affecting, the people who live in Iqaluit. One of the most direct links that we can draw between the environmental changes that we've already seen there and human systems involves food, and specifically access to food from the land around Iqaluit. We started out working with hunters who travel on that land all the time and who are experiencing these changes firsthand. And we also talked to people in Iqaluit who weren't getting enough to eat and as a result were turning to safety nets like the soup kitchen for their meals. What we hadn't yet studied was the link between the food that's brought in off the land and the people who are really feeling the effects of a reduced food supply, especially in the extreme climatic conditions that we saw 2 winters ago. Sarah's work during that really tough year I think really helps us understand how communities across the Arctic might respond to similar conditions that we expect to see in the future.
Winter 2010-2011 brought extreme environmental conditions throughout the Canadian Arctic, and these really had local impacts in Iqaluit. The temperatures were the warmest on record. The sea ice didn't freeze up until almost 2 months later than the long-term average, and when it did freeze up, it was thinner and more dangerous than ever before. Our aim was to characterize the vulnerability and resilience of the traditional food system to extreme environmental conditions. So what we wanted to do was find out whether or not these conditions impacted the ability of the Inuit hunters to harvest their traditional foods, and whether this caused any sort of food insecurity at the community level. So we interviewed 25 local hunters and surveyed 100 public housing residents to find out what factors shape vulnerability and adaptive capacity. These extreme conditions did impact Iqaluit's ecosystem. And this sort of created an interesting paradox for the hunters. So while seal were really available, the hunters said that there were lots around, they weren't necessarily able to harvest them because the poor sea ice conditions meant that they didn't feel comfortable going out on the bay. On the other hand, conditions on the land were really great and the hunters were happy to take the land routes instead. But unfortunately, the caribou weren't really around Iqaluit very much, and that's because their vegetation got locked into the ice, which meant that they had to forage farther inland, and this meant that the hunters had to travel further distances to get caribou. What we found is that there are many opportunities for resilience in Iqaluit, and these include things such as sharing networks, which allow non-hunting households to still obtain their country food, even though they can't necessarily harvest it themselves. Overall, what this project finds is that when poor environmental conditions, such as those experienced during winter 2010-2011, are combined with poor socioeconomic conditions, such as those really common throughout the north, these can combine to really influence the traditional food system in a negative way and cause food insecurity.
We aim to understand, to inform. The ultimate aim of this work is to try and find ways in which we can identify opportunities for adaptation. By adaptation refers to ways in which we can reduce the negative impacts of climate change and take advantage of new opportunities. It's about strengthening indigenous systems, knowledge systems, communities to better deal with climate change, and finding ways in which we can do this, be it at a local level or be it more formally through, say, policy structures at a regional and national level. We're not mitigating. Emissions continue to grow year on year. So what we need to be thinking more about, I think, in our communities, in our governments, in the scientific community is how can we adapt? What can we do to better deal with climate change? What do we need to do locally? What can policy interventions do to foster more adaptive societies? Because when we move forward, that's what we're going to do. We're going to have to adapt in the future.